I am one of 4 people taking part in an artistic residency. After the end of each week, we have the task to collectively write a logbook with reflections about our research, which is then published on our sponsor's website. Throughout this video, I will be referring to some texts written by my colleagues and by me on this logbook. You can find the links to the entire texts in the logbooks on the description of this video. This one was written by one of my colleagues at the beginning of our residency. Mein Wunsch ist es, eine Utopie zu schaffen, eine Utopie, die so glaubhaft erscheint, dass sie der Realität ähnelt oder sogar Realität wird. Whereas I wrote on the same page, I start this residency from within the failed utopia of collective, collaborative work. One voice that wants to uphold the utopia, and another one that says that we already failed. 2 apparently irreconcilable ideas. The title of our research is Nestbau, chtiges Zuhause. Our premise, that a home is a nest, is a home, is a nest. What is a nest but a constructed border, permeable to some, fragile yet protecting, a temporary home, a fleeting home. My colleagues have chosen to build a nest with materials like fabric, wool, paper. The material that I have chosen is discourse. How can discourse create a home? The fact that language belongs to all of us, and at the same time, not really, not to you or to me in particular, makes it a very fertile ground for constructing a fleeting home, a flüchtiges Zuhause. Home is what I feel comfortable to both stay silent and speak about difference and conflict. That's ideally my home. That's an utopian home. And that's what I've tried to realize here. So maybe failure and utopia are not irreconcilable ideas after all. Maybe they do belong together. Let's go back to our logbook and to another quote from one of my colleagues. Jemand kann nicht jemand anderen einfach als bezeichnen. What words would you fit in there? What can you easily not call someone? How about abusive? Aggressive? Invasive? Patriarchal? Unprofessional? These are some of the things that some of my colleagues have called me or my behavior when I have voiced opinions that they don't like or in ways that they don't like, or advanced artistic propositions in a way that they don't like. But even if I find them unfair or inaccurate, I am not here to tell them what they can or cannot call me. I am not interested in censorship. At the start of our residency, I communicated to my colleagues my decision of not working with one of them as an act of self-care. At the same time, I extended an invitation to my other 2 colleagues to find ways of working together in spite of or even beyond the conflict. I then wrote about this decision on the logbook, because the artistic work for me is not just one result that I show the audience, while keeping obscured the processes, group dynamics, and working conditions that made the work possible. I believe I had set in motion another way of conceiving collective work, and this needed to become visible. It is also a decision that had everything to do with making myself at home, which is the topic of our research. I will now quote from my own entry in the logbook. I decided I will not do the affective labor of setting limits for one of my colleagues so that they will not take over everyone else's time and space. I will not design ways to make this person feel that they are in charge in order to keep their anger contained and avoid the even more extenuating labor of dealing with their anger. I have done this work in the past in another project. I later realized that it was more than just miscommunication. It was a pattern of behaviors that I can now identify as toxic masculinity and yes, these are big words. And as with all big words, there are ongoing discussions as to what they mean. I welcome the continuation of these discussions. I am also aware that reality is more complex than words, and that it exists beyond words. But today, I am using these words to set a necessary limit. When I saw these behaviors repeat themselves on our first day of rehearsal, I said to them and to the collective that I am not willing to do this labor anymore, and I shouldn't have to. I set my limit there, and they are not allowed to come into my fleeting home, because that's the only way that I can make myself at home. This text prompted one of my colleagues to write the already mentioned quote, Jemand kann nicht einen anderen einfach als bezeichnen. What other word could we also fit in there? I'm thinking also transphobic. A few weeks ago, an academic presentation at the Humboldt University in Berlin by biologist Marie-Louise Vollbrecht was cancelled for security reasons after a group of trans activists protested against it. The title of her presentation, Geschlecht ist nicht gleich Geschlecht. Sex, Gender und warum es in der Biologie nur zwei Geschlechter gibt. I don't know what she wanted to say, nor if I agree with her. I also don't believe that there is such a thing as transparent objectivity in science. But I could imagine that her views in biology do not necessarily exclude the performativity of gender. But how could we find out if we silence her without second thought? Or how about anti-Semitic? Can we easily call someone anti-Semitic in order to silence them? The latest example is from Documenta. The artworks by Indonesian collective Tarim Padi and the Palestinian group The Question of Funding were taken down due to accusations of anti-Semitism. How is it that we as a society are not able to handle the complexity of both the Jewish experience and the Palestinian experience without excluding one another? From psychoanalysis, we have learned that the suppression of feelings will only cause them to reemerge with more force in the form of different symptoms. In trying to censor me, my colleague also had to censor herself and erase from her text the word and replace it with. It is an act of censorship that has turned back onto itself, creating a vacuum of words and an even bigger self-imposed silence. After I used the word in my text, my colleague in question marked the word and linked it to this article from the German Constitution, which details fines and prison time that I might have to serve in the case of a defamation lawsuit. They did not attempt other forms of communication to respond to me, but showed me that the next step would be appealing to the patriarchal state for an intervention, one that could finally get my mouth shut so that I would never say. There I was, being pushed to the courtroom, although I never wanted a verdict of guilt. I tried to distance myself from labeling and cancellation culture by speaking only from my experience, acknowledging that reality is more complex than words, and by making clear that it was my understanding of their behavior that would make me call it. This should have given space for other manifestations of their subjectivity to emerge. But this possibility is taken away by the very same people who are censoring the word. These calls for proof only reinforce the labels that they seem to want to criticize. When I am told that I cannot call them a if I cannot prove it, when I am told that I can only call them if it is objectively true from the point of view of the legal system, of the justice system, they are taking away their own possibility to emerge as something other than. Is there a way I can speak about without my words being transformed into the monstrification of the other? Can we take it out of the courtroom and out of the illusion of objective truth? What is more patriarchal than that? I agree with philosopher and writer Carolina Sanin, who said, and I quote, "Misogyny is not just killing a woman, ladies, nor is machismo beating up a woman. That is the last step on a road whose previous steps you often approve of. What will it take for you to realize that? On this road, I encounter voices that said to me, if you manage to do a project with them, if you manage to rehearse one day with them, you can surely manage a week, a month, for the sake of the collective. Is there really a need to make such a big deal out of this?" Carolina Sanin speaks of a tacit pact among most men, not all men, but most men, to reaffirm their superiority over women. Women authors are celebrated a few years in their youth, like a novelty, while older authors are forgotten. Only men have the right to perpetuity. If a woman's work is superior to that of men, she will be ridiculed, ostracized, and silenced. She also speaks of men praising only women writers who are mediocre, or who let themselves be the protégé of men, or who only speak from their conditions of victims, of how hard it is to be a woman, so that they will look like friends of feminism and inclusion. These men are misogynists. Misogynist is my colleague who, in their binary way of thinking, can only see my leadership as a threat and his role not as that of a collaborator, but as the opposition to some perceived threatening abuse of power. Misogynist is my colleague who hindered my creativity with anger, only to then go and do the exact same thing I had started to do. Only that this time it was acceptable because they were in charge. Misogynist is the man on the train who bumped into my feet, although I was just occupying the space assigned to my seat, and then turned angry to me for not getting out of his way. Misogynists are men and women in my life, some of whom I love, which is an interesting contradiction. Misogynists are you and me if we do not deconstruct our feelings and actions and the patriarchal structures in which they emerge. I am very grateful and indebted to feminists before me who have given me the power to name it. Without their help, I wouldn't have been able to understand behaviors and events as toxic masculinity and misogyny. Without their help, I wouldn't have been able to draw a necessary limit for my safety. Without their help, I wouldn't have these words at my disposal, which have the power to change the order of things. But I am also aware of the risk of staying stuck naming it, of repeating the same word over and over again until it is empty of signification. These words are not a place to get stuck on. They are a place of transit towards something else, towards something new. I think this is how these words were initially conceived, and I like to honor that. Toxic masculinity, misogyny, toxic masculinity, misogyny, toxic masculinity, misogyny, toxic, toxic, toxic masculinity, toxic, misogyny, toxic masculinity, toxic masculinity,